Good to know. Don't say anything stupid. And we'll let everybody kick in. And Chevelle's there if we need her, Kyle, but pretty much we got this whole thing. I haven't messed with the Clubhouse yet. I know Kelsey Applebaum, which you know, right? Kelsey, she's pretty active on Clubhouse. I do know that.
I haven't been on Clubhouse in some time. I think I just met Kelsey recently, just through this talk. I chatted with her a bit yesterday.
Sure, yeah.
No, again, it's been some time since I've been on Clubhouse. I do miss it though.
I've heard what you said, right? That a lot of people like great place for content, great place for connections, but you can like look up and you've lost an afternoon, so to speak.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And more often than not, the talk or the panels that should be a lot more directed and focused on Clubhouse tend to veer off in every odd sort of direction. You come and for a while, there was a lot of rooms on solventless and hash production. You'd see Hash Queen in there, and even Frenchie made his way into one of the club rooms at one point. But then you have people talking about everything from food and beverage industry to cultivation practices to commercial scale hash production, and everything just completely not related to the topic. You know, regulations, prohibition, enforcement, all random things. You just go in all these crazy directions, and people just tend to nerd out and occasionally plug their companies and brands. And I do miss it, but yeah, not while I'm on the clock.
I hear. Well, I appreciate you doing this with us while you're on the clock, right? Yeah, I think it's going to be helpful. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make sure everyone's got a chance to jump in. I usually give it 2, 3, 4 minutes or so. And I'll communicate with Chevelle on the other side in case we need to kick anything off, but we will hold up. So I guess, it's been a little bit since you and I talked before we dive into the background. How you been?
I've been great. I've been interesting. Yeah. Being on the hemp side of the industry now and everything that is changing in our landscape, namely like isomerized cannabinoids soon to being regulated, Delta 8, having been outlawed for production in Oregon and Washington, how that'll change things up. A lot of the interesting practices and products that are coming out now because of really the big boom in Delta 8, which I consider to be an enormous commercial opportunity in our industry. Everyone else has as well too.
Sure.
Things are definitely changing a lot and quickly. Between that, the new PAC Act, what products can and can't ship to places that we can produce, and just really the lack of regulation in the hemp industry, for instance, that leads to a huge plethora and almost oversaturation of lots of different simply produced products and ones that are labeled interestingly, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
Things like solventless Delta 8, which you would run into and sometimes, or even seeing flower grown in different ways, like seeing indoor hemp flower, for instance, in the market now. Very curious prices, lots of odd things. So there's there's a good opportunity in our industry for good practices and good products as well. And now with the whole shift of everything, really curious to see, as always, the hemp industry has wanted to mirror and give quality like cannabis products. And it's sort of been everyone's job to mirror and angle those products as well, and produce them as ethically as possible. And from my angle, that's why there is a need for regulation in the future, without a doubt.
It's a good question. And I've heard folks talk on the hemp pundit side of things, right? Like how we're going to deal with the scale meeting our ethics, essentially, when we're going for industrial hemp as well. So we might get into that as well. But before we dive too deeply, because we don't want to waste the content, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So we have one person on time, which is Steven. Steven, you're the man. If you want to throw anything in the chat or the Q&A, this so far is kind of customized to you. Kyle and I will do intros here in a moment, but it seems like we have a chance to really answer any questions you want, which is great. But it's nice to see Hootie and Logan as well. They're definitely folks that have been on a lot of the panels for us. They're friends of Banks, which is great. But just to kind of kick us off, and we'll do this if some other kind of folks jump in too. But my name's Spencer. I'm going to technically be moderating the panel because Kyle's the brains behind everything. And so we'll make sure we get all the info we can from him. But my quick pitch is I work here at Bankst. I've been here just shy of 2.5 years. I serve on our direct hire team and do a lot of impact headhunting and recruiting for our clients that need really anything and everything. But kind of the purpose of this panel and why I think we're here is a lot of what we do is any kind of operations, extraction, lab, analytics, supply chain, that sort of middle part of the cannabis processing sphere. That's a lot of the searches we do as well. And so we're lucky enough to be joined by Kyle Farouk, who is Mr. Extraction himself. And so I am going to let him speak pretty much to everything. But Kyle, if you want to run us through your kind of quick where you're at right now, we'll dig into your background a little bit later, a little bit later to kind of walk us to where you are now. But give us the quick pitch on what you're doing right now.
Great. Thanks, Spencer. I've been on the hemp side of the industry for probably the last roughly 2 to 3 years. I've been on the cannabis side of the industry for about five or so. I've been in California, I've been in Oregon, installing a lab in Portland, working on sort of manufacturing projects in Central Oregon as well too, namely scale up pre-roll and hemp cigarette manufacturing processes. That's actually going to be a really big market driver coming up as well soon. So really, I'm a chemical engineer. My background, I help businesses install, commission, and design manufacturing facilities, MIP facilities, however you'd like to call them, labs, and all such things. And as well now downstream, or actually commercial kitchens, you'd say, downstream processing laboratories, or what I call RIP scheme laboratories, as well. Commercial kitchens and co-packing facilities, because that is really the big side of the driver now. There's much more of a demand for consulting and help with formulation and new product development, as there are new types of products that people are getting interest to, and quite a large supply of formulation bases that a lot of groups throughout the country are doing really well. That's been my time here. Currently, I am with a hemp wholesale company in Portland, Oregon called the Hemp Collect. We're a bulk wholesaler and also retail goods wholesaler of many different types of hemp products, namely a lot of Delta 8 THC products. And I've come in to help in-house a lot of our production that is otherwise being outsourced to other producers and find solutions for that there. So it's been a bit of my time recently, a lot of product development with terpene-based formulations, Delta 8 and Delta 10 based formulations, and soon live resin product formulations. That is a very advantageous thing that we hope to see as kind of a new pivot in the direction of the hemp industry as products like Delta 8 THC become more regulated in the future.
Gotcha. No, it sounds like with all those moving parts, they're definitely lucky to have you over there in Portland with them, which is great. And so what I think I want to focus on first is I at our heart, I think Bankst is, definitely a recruiting talent company. And so everyone wants to understand exactly, how their background or your background affects what you do on a positive basis. And so I definitely want to dive into your background. But first, I guess, I know this is kind of putting you on the spot to an extent, but if you had to give me some kind of generalized overview of extraction methods, right? Cannabis, hemp, take this wherever you want. But, just for example, like when I started in cannabis recruiting, I heard about CO2 versus ethanol extraction. And something in my chemistry 101 day in college was there, but I didn't really know the difference. And so, by no means do you have to do an exhaustive list, but if you want to kind of give the overview of, what cannabis or hemp extraction means, what it looks like on a day-to-day basis, I think that'd be a good baseline for us before we dive into something deeper.
Sure, absolutely. I always love to give this answer from a chemical engineer standpoint, which is what I am, a chemical process engineer. And as you mentioned, we keyword the name extraction, or the idea of extraction. Essentially, everything that is in our industry is a recovery of an active ingredient that exists endogenously in the plant, which are cannabinoids, and they're outside on the resin glands of the flower, of trim, of any hemp or cannabis raw material feed. So there are two sides of what is called bioseparations. Bioseparations is the entire academic and theoretical overview of what we do. And there's extractive bioseparations and reactive bioseparations. Reactive is a much different thing. That's industrial chemical manufacturing and even things like wine and beer production, fermentation sciences. Our entire industry is on the basis of extractive bioseparations, which is extracting an active compound from a raw material source in as efficient a means as possible, and then recovering and purifying that to essentially an isolated product by the end, whether that is in full 100% almost pharmaceutical or HPLC grade purity, or it's in the level of a craft purity, for instance, lower purity, but containing other compounds and other elements that give these extracts their quality and uniqueness. So really extraction, all in all, the idea is to choose a method that recovers, whether it be THC or CBD for the most part, in as high efficiency as possible. Efficiency also meaning as much of that target and as little of the contaminants that may come along. We see this in ethanol extraction with cold ethanol extraction. So freezing your ethanol to below 20 or 40 Celsius and extracting it there allows you to extract more of your active compounds and leaving behind contaminants like pigments, chlorophyll, impurities, sugars and gums, fatty acids, things like that that require downstream refinement, which is oftentimes a big bottleneck for a lot of businesses, leads to a lot of cost, just logistics that end up leading to either lower quality or higher cost and good. This is extraction is that at its core. It is recovering your target product that already exists in the plant without it changing the nature of that compound. So minimizing heat, light exposure, oxidation. And by the end, you're left with a high purity product or one that is angled towards being the best input for what types of consumer goods you're trying to manufacture.
Gotcha. No, and that makes a lot of sense, right? And I guess the follow-up there is, you talk to big companies, you talk to small companies, you talk to folks that have never extracted and they're putting their first processes together, or they're on their fifth, sixth, seventh different kind of run, right? So I guess how does a company, when they're setting up, how do they go about choosing which extraction method they're going after? Is it based on end product and they work backwards? Is it because of cost or skilled work? Well, what's kind of the story about how you choose what you're going to go after?
It's a good question. There's a combination of several things. Definitely your end product. Each extraction method will produce a different form of an end product because you're extracting with a solvent, more often than not, CO2 in liquid form is considered a solvent. There's hydrocarbon solvents, which are petrochemical derived, butane, heptane, pentane, all such things. And ethanol, polar solvents, that's a big class as well too. And each one of these will select for certain cannabinoids or certain compounds in a certain level of efficiency. And that efficiency is very important, is how long does this extraction take to recover your target compound, with what cost does it go into it? And those costs can be solvents. So in your process, you choose a process if it maybe requires a lower amount of solvent to recover your compound, or that solvent is highly recyclable and therefore your process is more sustainable. That's why a lot of people go with CO2 extraction. It's because it's a very compliant, it's a pharmaceutically regulated and compliant manufacturing process that came from the pharmaceutical industry for the most part. It's how, for instance, pesticides are purified out of products. It's how botanical oils are extracted. It's used a lot in pharmaceutical and food industry. So that technology was very well married into our industry. Also, for instance, depending on the end products that you're trying to create, a good example of this is in the cannabis industry. There's always been a bit of a tussle back and forth with vape cartridges, either hydrocarbon extracted oil or CO2 extracted oil going into vape cartridges. There has been for some time, in my opinion, an unfair rhetoric that a lot of CO2 oil extracted and used for vaporizers doesn't taste, I want to say the same, but all has a similar base note of one similar flavor that somebody that knows this, that is a connoisseur of these products and a regular user will taste them and say, oh, that's CO2 oil that you got there. Hydrocarbon for a lot of processors is a way for them to differentiate and really keep the unique strain qualities of the strain dependent batches that they're producing. It's how we have things like live resin products, the high terpene types of fresh frozen extracts, which can as well be done with CO2, but depending on your end user and your target market is more often than not why you choose a certain manufacturing process. And that's also why the hemp industry is mostly dominated by ethanol extraction. Ethanol does not it's not a high terpene extract that you're looking to create by the end. Ethanol processing really is a high throughput, very efficient, and also very sustainable means of extracting CBD, for example. It's much favored in our industry for that matter. Yeah, because there's one pretty good.
No, I definitely appreciate it, because I always wondered, with we're going to get into on the job training, right? Because obviously your background, I've checked it out before, right? Environmental sciences degree, right? You have a master's from SUNY in chemical engineering processing, and like throughout your career, like you've definitely been on the science side of the house, and it's been, I have no doubt, great building blocks for your career within cannabis, CBD, and hemp. But I guess one thing I want to talk about in terms of these processes is the idea of like on the job training, right? Whether it's a specific, hey, I was brought in to be the ethanol extraction tech, and that's the one machine I'll work on, versus someone that's maybe doing BHO or someone that's just an extra set of hands in the lab. So I guess, can you talk to me about, you've led teams, so you're hiring someone new, maybe they don't have the educational background that we've just talked about. What is kind of the first 2 weeks? What is the first kind of like training program? What are the most important like first things that person can learn to be successful in the lab? I know it's a loaded question.
It's a great loaded question. There are really many great things. Honestly, I like to staff my lab with STEMs. I like people that have had previous laboratory training, because in the end, you are dealing with some pretty high cost equipment. Typically, these labs, the ones that are built, to GMP and to recent fire code, are very safe. So you don't risk a lot of the old kind of issues we had with unregulated hydrocarbon laboratories. A lot of those risks and a lot of those casualties are actually still occurring right now to these days. So at the very least, it is an environment where there is risk for exposure to solvents. Sounds like there's dogs are by.
I'm surprised mine haven't gone off, so you're totally fine.
Okay, cool. There is definitely, I believe, a basis of lab background training that does help getting into these spaces. And the proper transfer of materials, sterile transfer techniques, really lab GMP is a great basis to go off of that I look for in candidates. But that doesn't disqualify anybody by any means from having a good shot at our industry. Really, I've known great processors with absolutely no background in the sciences or STEM education that pick these things up and learn really well, because a lot of our industry has become traditionally passed on over time. A lot of these methods are learned, developed, shared over time, passed on, trained, and shadowed in. And I'm a big proponent for that. In the lab that I've worked in, we're an open book there, and for the most part, an academic lab. So we want people to come in possibly with some experience or with none at all, but definitely with a sense of attention to detail in all the places that will require it, both in quality assurance and quality control, and of course, safety are enormous things. So I have worked with, I have had technicians that have been chefs in restaurants, boat mechanics, car mechanics, people work in agriculture, on farms, and things like that. I actually trained a really awesome candidate that was a leader of a hemp breeding program up here in Oregon. And she came in and was one of the best technicians I've ever had, that picked up everything and applied that to a really general overview of how she can contribute to the industry. Big opportunity piece that I like to always have people understand with extraction is that we are in the middle of the supply chain in the industry. We sit in between the upstream of production cultivation and agriculture, and downstream from product development, kitchens, consumer goods, and retail and wholesale, and all those elements. So getting an experience in extraction and in manufacturing gives you some really great insight and application to either of those two directions. Whether you come from cultivation and want an extraction experience, or you come from a retail or even marketing or business experience and want to work upstream from that. If you have the interest in qualification, some base qualifications, and really want to pick up, it's more often than not a home for you and a kind of place if you're really willing to learn.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm really kind of emboldened to hear you say that with folks that I've spoken to. Whether they're just coming out of college, or maybe they're trying to transition their career into cannabis, and like it's really hard for folks to see, hey, I don't have an extraction experience, but they've worked in a GMP lab, right? They've worked in very safe suited places. They have maybe serve safe applications, right? The things that you just talked about, like there is a baseline. You just need to find it and hopefully get some good training with where you ask. And so my little recruiter plug here is, if you are ever going into a job and you're right there at the offer stage, always try to understand what the training program looks like, just so you know what you're getting yourself into. Because there's good trainers out there for sure, but some people, just one of those things where everyone's really busy and they don't really have a good plan, and so they need it. So when you position yourself, you talked about where we're at in the supply chain of cannabis production, which is really exciting. Not to anger any of the cultivators on the call, but I am interested in this. I heard someone asked me this the other day. So does it matter what the quality of hemp or cannabis flower that you're getting in when you're just running it through an extractor? Does the quality of the actual plant matter?
Sure, absolutely. Whether you're on the cannabis or the hemp side of the industry, we see it more obviously in the craft goods, and for instance, craft cannabis concentrates, that obviously your input, not just on the potency, of the flower, but really the quality that it's grown, and the terpene profile as well, play enormously to the output of those products, of those like name and specific concentrates. And there's, for instance, been a lot of rhetoric in the industry about CRC, color remediation chromatography, and how you can put in a very low quality product and come out with a good looking color extract in the end. This has been, for instance, a refinement method that has been used for a good amount of time. It's nothing more than using carbon adhesion agents and clay bleaching agents, what they're called. And that's just helping to remove impurities. More often than not, you will extract impurities when you are inputting a low quality input material or using extraction methods that are not well defined and not well optimized, that end up recovering out impurities. A lot of those times those products are not eligible to really be craft products because they require so much refinement and purification that by the end, if you were to attempt to make a high quality good, your cost would simply just be too high. More often than not, depending on your end good, it is very advantageous to use high quality input material, and having somebody that can grade and see and recognize that is insanely important. The thing to recognize with labs is that, and with manufacturing, is that it's not always so technique based. Somebody like a chemical engineer like me comes in and designs and sets up a process, and then we build out SOPs for standardized optimized process, and technicians are operating off of SOPs. So there's not often any special trick or thing that you do. You're really following simple standardized instructions. So the only variability that you have in your end product is based on the input material, and having somebody that can grade that really well. As an example, the girl that I had hired, that was one of the best technicians I've ever worked with. She was the breeding director for a hemp farm up here in Oregon. So I specifically hired her because she has such a keen eye on raw material QC, and knowing for the material that we're sourcing and potentially being able to calibrate, this is my input material. It comes at this potency with this grade of flower, with this particle size of buds, harvested in this such of a way, coming from this region. For instance, Central Oregon has a lot of microclimates. So raw material grown in Central Oregon is vastly different from anything in the north side or west of the Cascades, much different than anything grown in Southern Oregon. And the best hemp material that I've extracted ever came from Central Oregon, which was a pretty dry, high desert with great irrigation. I specifically hired this person to come on and get an experience in my lab because I wanted her to have that insight to know what the output quality of our bulk oil that we're making is dependent on her perspective of being so well trained in raw material sciences, agriculture and horticulture. And now she's using both of those, all of that knowledge really well in a wholesale company that she's working with right now.
Definitely a good skill set, right? No, that's fantastic. And I'm glad to hear you say that because, you know, we talk about the idea of fresh or fresh frozen and all these different things when they go into extraction. And so it is nice to hear that you, if you can, right, partner with the best cultivators, you know, which is always a good thing. So I know you've worked in a few different states, right? Currently you're in Oregon and, you know, you can go in this in your background, but in terms of manufacturing chemistry, right? Whatever extraction material we're talking about, end product we're talking about, you know, without going specifically into each state in the union, right? Is there any like big, you know, differences state by state that you see where one state has very different opinions on how to do manufacturing chemistry, or, you know, what concentrations of end products are? Is there anything you can share there? Because, you know, I don't know exactly where all our attendees reside, and we don't need to specifically get into all those markets, but I'd love the kind of quick national snapshot about if you're doing a job really well in Oregon, you know, is someone going to headhunt you to Oklahoma and you're going to hit the ground running, or is that a very different animal?
Sure. It's a tough question to ask. It's a tough question to answer because regulation-wise, there's not a lot of things yet in the current outlay of the industry of specific state markets that prohibits one business for operating in a place differently than another, namely market size and barrier to entry, being a lot of the drivers what gets from why one person would choose to, for instance, set up a business and operate in one state to another. Big indicators for me, of competitiveness in any new state market are the state markets that are well saturated with many brands competing, and which companies in those really can designate themselves on certain practices, on best methods. It's really hard to say regulatory wise why somebody would want to pick operating one state for another. That's probably a little bit above my expertise. Is more kind of tax reasons, zoning, and things like that, and access to material is a big one. I think Massachusetts underwent a pretty difficult time for a little while setting up their industry and supply chain based on input raw material being available for products. Also in certain markets, what kind of products are allowed to manufacture or not. If some new states only allow for no edible products and only vaporizable products, no combustible flower, such and things like that. Oregon, for an example, is a great market for a lot of people to get into, but insanely competitive because a lot of licenses were awarded to businesses pretty much on the outset of recreational. In Oregon, for that matter, there was a vast saturation of brands in our market here. However, the companies that do get in and are able to stand out with them, they are very competitive anywhere else that they would go in the country. So, for instance, Oregon is a really great marketplace to prove yourself, as an example. Taxes obviously are a big thing as well, too. Washington's tax rate compared to Oregon is, I want to say, nearly double. It was for some time. So in Oregon, you get a lot of recreational patrons from Nevada, even from California and from Washington that would come to buy a recreational product in Oregon for the price point and for the quality. Namely, CBD products were also very difficult to come by at a decent quality in Washington for a good amount of time, and I believe that's still an issue there. So all those things are really considerations for anyone trying to get into the industry and work. I wouldn't say that there is any one state which is more or less challenging to operate in. When I came in the industry in California, it was definitely before recreational. I came into California around 2014. That was a bit of an odd time. It was definitely a little higher security risk for people operating in the industry. There wasn't such a regulation, or there was a very simple regulation for security measures. And oddly, there was a little bit more of a region for danger, or for essentially requiring to be anonymous to your brand or company because of security issues that you would incur, theft, robbery, or being followed and such like that. I don't believe a lot of those issues still exist now, as opposed to what it was before. I think regulations have tightened up since California's gone rec. But either way, really, I think anyone trying to get in the industry is just taking good opportunity as it comes.
Yeah, and I think that you sold yourself short at the beginning. I think that's a really good answer, because it's funny, the landmark decision about New York, just for example, recently, like, hey, legalization. I don't know how many people called me and my company about like, hey, can you get me a job tomorrow? I'm like, that's not exactly how this works, because an ecosystem has to be built about cultivators, processors, analytical labs. Everything has to kind of come up. And so it's really interesting to kind of hear what you have to say, right? The proving ground of Oregon, for example, where, for folks on the call, if you're trying to get into cannabis and it's one of your first jobs within manufacturing or a lab space, maybe you can get into one of the training programs on a bigger company scale, and then use that as you learn from them to maybe go have more impact at a smaller company. Or if a new company or a new state like Connecticut, right, they just had their landmark decision to legalize the other day. And so new labs will be popping up. And so it's interesting to see like, well, hey, I can have a lot of impact right away, but what does your background look like for that? And so, I think that having those conversations wherever you can is always a positive one. And so one thing I guess that dovetails out of regulation or processes within state to state is the idea that I feel like a lot of people, they focus specifically on making something, right? It's manufacturing chemistry. That's what the lay person outside of the industry thinks of as cannabis science. But we do have the analytical and testing side of the industry. And so I know specifically you're not in a testing lab right now, but do you want to give a quick overview, whether it's specific methods or how it works within your process as the actual producer? How does an analytical or a third-party lab factor in?
From that, yeah. From that, I was in reference to somebody wanting an opportunity in analytical chemistry, or how does that affect my operations?
I would say go for the first one. Like, how does analytical work within the industry at large, right? Like, what part do they play? But then, as you said earlier about what you look for in early stage candidates, are there any specific processes that maybe someone learned in undergrad that maybe points them towards analytical chemistry instead of maybe manufacturing chemistry? Maybe kind of two birds, one stone there.
For sure. Analytical chemistry definitely takes a higher qualification of an operator to be able to work in that space, typically a chemistry degree. Specialize in analytical chemistry, for instance, to even really operate and manage an analytical laboratory, you would need a master's in these degrees in order, for instance, to calibrate HPLC machines. It's definitely not an entry-level position per se, and there is a lot of weight towards good analytical practices. That has been a big topic of our industry for some time, is ethical lab practices and adhering to regulations pretty well of such, to which case there's been a lot of, I wouldn't say corruption is not the right word towards it, but there has been gained a lot of distrust over the years for not so credible analytical laboratory businesses. So for that matter, I like to touch on integrity very well. With that, in the cannabis realm, there is a set protocol that has to be met to test. And for businesses like us, a whole lot of our cost is based on testing in the cannabis sector, because you have to test per each essentially SOP that is produced. If a separate SOP creates a separate product, then there is a full panel of testing required for it. There's control study that's required for testing, which proves validates the homogeneity of a product, which I find very, very important. This would be the same case for any other large player in any other food product related industry that needs to test and validate the homogeneity of their product. such that you don't get a 250 milligram chocolate bar and the next one is only 100 milligram chocolate bar. It's accurate, very important for dosing. That's also very required on the cannabis side of the industry. Sadly, the hemp side of the industry still, in its gray space and lack of regulation, doesn't often require enough of these safe practices in order to validate both potency and safety and homogeneity of an end product. Also, not to mention that hemp products, bulk goods, are produced in a significantly higher volume. So for instance, a control study is typically a more expensive study that is required to be produced on a final consumer good production batch that will get turned into a retail product. That often is not, that regulation is required in the cannabis industry, but not required in the hemp industry. So for that matter, you need to test your bulk formulation bases before formulating with them to validate that they don't have a microbial content, they meet heavy metals, pesticides, and residual solvent levels, and more importantly for a formulator, knowing what's the exact potency in there so that you are, in a chemistry term, using stoichiometry well to accurately formulate the intended amount of cannabinoids as your label claims. Integrity is insanely important in our side of the manufacturing industry, in the hemp side of the manufacturing industry, because a lot of these things are not required. They're only required by the end client or the end user that's purchasing their products. And I've seen on our side of the industry, people that would want products procured to them quickly that are willing to purchase products without any forms of COAs coming to them. So for that matter, both being in a manufacturing space definitely has the ethical responsibility to make sure that you're doing adequate, that you're receiving products that are adequately tested, testing them in-house if need be, and if you have the infrastructure and staffing to do so, and then following your state guidelines for cannabis regulatory testing before putting out those products as well too, because if half the hemp industry wants to create similarly angled cannabis products, it should also make sense that we are following cannabis regulatory rules and guidelines. That's my angle there as well. So it's, yes, being in the analytics, shooting for the analytical side of the industry does take a little bit more qualifications to get in and to be part of that space, but then also very much operating with ethics and integrity.
And I'm glad to hear you say that secondary part, right? Because you can look back not so long ago, and even outside of the regulation idea, those relationships between analytical labs from a testing capacity and manufacturers, pretty contentious, right? It was a gotcha culture. It was something that was,
Yep.
Hey, sorry, you failed. There goes, your budget for the next quarter, right? And there wasn't this, I don't know, symbiotic relationship that if we can do good, ethical, intentful things into our market, the consumers are ultimately the one that benefit. And that's it hasn't been remedied, but like in these new states that come online, it seems like there's a bigger onus towards testing. Well, one, just number of testing labs so people don't get overwhelmed. But number two, like it actually seems like that function is coming in very, how do I say this? It's coming to the forefront earlier. And it seems like there's higher quality testing labs in some of these new states. But I guess, do you have any opinion on that?
Not yet thus far.
Sure.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't seen much of what the new testing labs are. I have a good amount of experience with the old ones, and with some of the current really credible ones, especially some of the ones that are part of bigger food and agricultural testing conglomerates, as an example. I've worked here in Oregon with the Tentimus Group, Columbia Food Labs. It's also called Texas Laboratories. And they're very, very highly accredited and well-practiced laboratory. And they've gained that reputation doing food safety and quality testing on many sides of the industry, for which cannabis testing is only one division of their grand portfolio. There's a lot of examples of good businesses like this. I also like NAPRO Research in California for that similar matter and angle.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense, right? So I guess real quick plug to all the attendees here, just while we're kind of approaching, not the end specifically, but we're on that way. if you have any specific questions, I've definitely got a lot more things to talk about, and Kyle has no doubt and undoubt or an endless amount of knowledge to provide for everybody here. But if you have something specific, throw a question in the chat. I'll make sure to get it read. Same thing with the Q&A. Just always doing to offer that up because everyone that showed up, if you have something specific that's burning, I want to make sure we hit it. So I guess another thing from the human capital perspective, while hopefully those trickle in, we've talked about like the background of a person, and we've talked about your background and like specific stuff. But let's say we have a high functioning lab. I don't really care what state, but it's a manufacturing lab and you are producing something with whatever extraction technique. What's kind of the hierarchy in a lab? Not like a one person lab, but something that's actually going about it. What specific titles maybe do specific things, and what does a fully staffed lab that's producing at a decent level look like?
Sure. Off the basis, your management is either an operations director or just a general manager of a facility. The operations director dealing with obviously much more bureaucratic and economic issues and cost related and resource related issues with the business, whereas you have your manufacturing lab is generally just your technical division that's tasked with the safe manufacturing of a product and optimizing that level of manufacturing consistently throughout time. So increasing quality and throughput of your good while minimizing cost. It's pretty much, I would say, always in the background of my mind. Oops, looks like I'm getting a little better in my phone. You there? There we go. I hope my phone doesn't cut out anytime soon. In which case I could switch over to my laptop, but I think I'm good for a bit. Sure. Yes. So your lab manager or manufacturing director, for that sense, is pretty much always tasked with safety and safety, namely always equipment management and upkeep and infrastructure upkeep, hugely, but also resource allocation. There are a lot of different activities that happen in labs at any given times. There could be packaging related activities, general manufacturing. Sometimes a lot of labs don't produce or manufacture quite consistently. You only produce to your demand. Sometimes people are producing a little more ad hoc, just specific product lines. It really depends on your nature of your business and your end user demand. So for that matter, typically your lab managers allocating labor to things like packaging and filling, for instance, vape cartridge filling, or gramming out retail products. Facility upkeep, equipment maintenance and service days are pretty big as well too. And then really below that on the personal level, you'll have your lab staff is obviously, outside of just being operators and technicians, are also tasked with upkeeping your facility. The big thing to really recognize, and why I mentioned attention to detail, and even why mechanics have been and contracting related folk have made great technicians over time, is because service and equipment maintenance is pretty much your biggest priority. And a manufacturing process that is based on consistent methods and following and adhering to SOPs. The two things that could ever go wrong are poor input quality of your raw material or equipment downtime. Namely, and pretty much always, as a technician, you can be asked to service and break down pumps, source vacuum and fluid leaks, look for gasket failures, look for hosing failures, look for gas meter failures, all such safety and production related things that end up leading to downtime. And this is things that have to be very stringently paid attention to by your daily operating technicians. That information relayed to the shift lead if you're operating a lab that's more than 3 or 4 technicians, with somebody that's tasked with the full seeing the full production flow and taking these things into consideration, and then relaying that upwards to your lab manager. So really, I see those levels and tiers. Is you have your operating personnel and technicians, you have some shift leads above that that gather all of the data information of your daily operating cadence, safety and service and maintenance related issues, or safety related issues, relaying that up to your general manager or operations director. And that's where things are managed at the technical level, at the manufacturing level. when I've seen mostly and recognized mostly that your the best forms of lab managers, I hate to, always side with engineers, being one, but half of the trading or responsibility of an engineer is engineering design economics, actually. So it's seeing the economics of flow in a business like this, your cost of materials and consumable items throughout the process, and continually minimizing costs, increasing efficiency, and making better products that come to the consumer at a greater level. That type of decision making is often relayed with your upper levels in a business and company. More often than not, it's people like that make the decision for, we should look at this type of processing or production line because it is a higher quality and lower cost, and just a more feasible type of method we want to go with, as opposed to looking at lower efficiency, unsafe practice methods, ones that are highly consumable, ones that lead to equipment failure and breakdown, things that generally mount up to more cost. That's where I see as a pretty big important part of the one who runs and manages the technical division.
And great overview. And I mean, those, I know they get unique within the cannabis, hemp, or CBD industries, but a lot of that is any high functioning lab, right? Food and beverage, alcohol production, botanicals, whatever it really is. And so, if anyone on this call has those skill sets, has run anything that Kyle just said, those are applicable skills within the cannabis industry as well, even if the end product's not the same. So always something to talk about. And I guess just with that, I mean, hit me quick with the kind of career trajectory. Hey, I started as one of the techs you were speaking of. What's kind of my timeline? What am I looking forward to in my career if I stay with the same company? What's kind of my step up?
Absolutely. Really through the progressions that I just mentioned, demonstrating that you have high level of attention to detail, adherence to best practices and safe practices and GMP, and really being a good team player. There's always opportunities for positive reinforcement in technical operator-based manufacturing spaces and negative ones. Setting up your job well and working well with teams, being communicative in these teams, and being really alert is one way that a business will trust you to want to move up and give you more responsibility, moving up the ladder. And obviously having just experience of this general oversight of, this is our mission, this is our production quota, this is what we're being tasked with in producing in such an amount of time. Let's get to doing that. I've been able to make cool decisions in the past of like, hey, you guys want to work 5/10s or 5/8 this week or 4/10s? We have a monthly production quota of vape cartridges. Do you guys want to work really hard in 3 or so weeks and do like 10 or even up to 12-hour days, if that's what we hope or intend for, and produce our quota in such an amount of time and maybe get a couple of days off by the end of the month? Manufacturing is, unless it's a continuously flowing process with the consistent end demand, some businesses have quota-based production incentives. And it's really cool to be able to work together as a team and say, how do we want to allocate our labor and our time to producing what's required of us and meeting the specific needs and demands of our business? I've seen really great labs operate like this, and teams work really harmoniously together through this. So that's a bit of a side tangent from the question that you asked there, but yeah. At that space and at that place, I like to say that we're in manufacturing, which could be botanical oil processing. It could be concentrated ingredients and formulation bases. Product development is where I chose personally, actually, as a direction coming from manufacturing, because more often than not, if you're in a cannabis lab that's producing a specific craft extract, maybe that is your end good that's going to the retail shelves. For instance, in the CBD space, in the hemp space, you're producing a lot of bulk formulation bases, whether that is concentrated oils, isolates, water-soluble extracts as well too, and then even designated formulation bases for specific product categories like tincture formulation bases or solid powder formulation bases for anhydrous or water-free products. That gives you a lot of exposure and direction into food and beverage. side of the industry and into really commercial scale kitchen production. I see that as a really great pivot for somebody getting experience in cannabis or hemp extraction and saying, hey, I want to take this thing further. I want to actually be involved in the concepting and creation of these consumer good products and bringing those things out to market. You can get a great amount of exposure as well there too. Marketing and branding of these products, the design of them, top to bottom costs, producing an MVB product and seeing how that can continually raise and change in quality over time. For instance, coming out with the baseline, let's say baseline gummy, and then introducing strain specific terpenes to that gummy product over time, and then introducing minor cannabinoid ratios over time. And then down the line, there may be a more functional based version of that product that incorporates nutraceuticals or adaptogenic or nootropic herbs, and things like that. I've seen people that start in one piece of the wing and want to go down the direction of consumer goods, maybe marketing, maybe bulk or wholesale supply of those goods. A lot of people actually get experience and then branch off and start their own companies. They start their own labs. They've gained that kind of experience or funding. I'm involved with a really great group up here in Oregon, Treats Edibles. That was once a great partnership with the Buddy's brand as well too. And now my great colleague, Joel Thompson, is going to move into a full-scale direction of solventless, vegan solventless edibles that I'm going to collaborate pretty well with him. And that's a really cool niche side of an industry. And really, there is a lot of opportunity for anybody to go in entrepreneurial directions into like sales angles or marketing and branding angled focused directions. You can even travel all the way back upstream, back into cultivation, for instance, if that's the side. And that's essentially what the technician that I worked with before has done. She got a really great experience in manufacturing, and now moving upside back into the cultivation direction, she has a really great eye or perspective on how certain grades of raw material has to be cultivated and harvested and even milled and pre-treated to make it.
No, he was on a roll. That was a good spot. Kyle, are you still around or your phone die? Because, well, you came off mute. No, you didn't. Well, actually, I kind of wanted to hit on that point he was making because we're on our way down. Hopefully Kyle joins us back up. But, like the singular truth that Kyle was saying about being in the lab and moving upstream, downstream, moving towards your other lab, moving somewhere else is learning.
There we go.
Hey, no worries. I was trying to distill essentially what you said in terms of like learning subject matter about the industry, whether it's from a lab perspective, sales, marketing, cultivation. That springboards you towards a lot of things, right? It opens so many. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it springboards you to so many different things. I mean, you kind of hit one thing I did. I don't know how many like socially inclined scientists that I pulled out for sales jobs because they can speak to their end user of their product, whether they're selling equipment or they're selling wholesale, whatever it ultimately is. It just makes a lot of sense. And so I really like what you said there. But one thing, I guess the last question I want to hit, because we're out of time, and while I have you back is, kind of a two-parter here. What's your favorite thing about working in the industry? What makes you excited to stay here, to continue to highly perform in this industry and bring things to consumers? So that's number one. And then also like your last word to anybody that maybe is looking to get into the industry. I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, and the reason I came to the industry in the offset, especially as a STEM, there's a lot of other industries that you're in, whether as a chemical process engineer, would have been fermentation sciences or industrial chemical manufacturing or feedstock sciences for the most part. These are very developed industries with set, very conservative practices that have been reproduced for, generations, oddly, decades and decades and decades. We are definitely, this will be the case for a long time, and it's very understandable that we're a forefront industry. We are creating new solutions, new products, new technologies all the time. The boom of Delta 8 was a great example of capitalizing off of an oversupply, for instance, of CBD isolate. And by mistake, recognizing that we were able to produce a Farm Bill compliant product. You getting me, by the way? Is my audio okay? Hey, can you hear me, Spencer?
You're coming through.
I'm coming through? Okay, good. Sorry, you froze it there for a little bit.
My bad.
No problem. I'll just keep talking in the case that it won't freeze, but we're gonna hope that it won't freeze. What I was saying, yeah, that we have a lot of opportunity for growth in this industry. Delta 8 was a good example of a huge new solution that was created really by mistake of of putting particulate treatment agents in a short path distillation flask and looking to clean up a CBD crude oil base, and out came Delta 8. It was a mistake of reaction, and now the whole marketplace and industry has just exploded from that, literally off of just a lab mistake, and it's protected under the Farm Bill, and has been a great solution, a huge industry for us. There are still a lot of technologies underdeveloped in refinement technologies, for instance, organic solvent nanofiltration membranes, I believe will be a big innovation in lab processing that can cut out a lot of the intermediary steps in the middle of processing, reduce a lot of costs and consumables, and end up creating a greater end product. And that is still being optimized and developed as we speak in our industry right now. There is a huge terpene industry, a bulk terpene and strain specific terpene industry coming up right now that's becoming more available as hemp products are wanting to be angled and produced more in that same quality to cannabis products. So there's amazing collaborations right now coming out with that. True Terpenes, for instance, just launched a whole line of hemp-derived strain-specific terpenes and blends and alchemies of such. That's a really interesting direction, and where all that will go is pretty amazing. So what got me into this, I was interested for the innovation side of it 8 years ago when I got into the industry, really, and that's only still continually developed more as there is new consumer demand for different types of products, and as we're coming out with new things, solventless being another big thing. Solventless bases and products are really a huge market, are an incredible quality product, but are going to be really hard for us to scale and design that upwards and meeting that same level of quality, not to mention all of the variation and attention to QA and QC in the raw material that translates to yield, efficiency of yield, if you're making a solventless base like a hash or a rosin product. So there's just so much possibility. Somebody can get into the industry now and have still 20 years worth of innovation that they can contribute to. That, to me and to anybody else wanting to, that's freaking really exciting.
That, yeah, I think that's a great thing to end on, to be very frank, is the idea of like getting in now. There's so much more to be discovered and things to scale and do everything. So
there's one more.
Kyle,
yep, sorry.
I would say we're at the end of our time.
There's one more thing I do want to mention that I think is really important. Is another thing for people to want to look out for is sustainability initiatives in our industry. I don't think it's nearly talked about enough, and there's so many opportunities for businesses to implement this in their practices and in their MO. But a little fact piece that I like to tell people about when trying to design these processes and facilities is that almost every business wastes about 60% of the carbon that enters our doors. So only roughly 30% of the carbon leaves as a consumer good or a product. And more often than not, the spent raw material that leaves our facilities, very little of it is actually eligible for composting. If you extract material with a hydrocarbon solvent, a lot of that biomass goes to waste. Our industry is a big carbon waster, and there is a ton of opportunity for sustainable practices in carbon upcycling and energy efficiency that doesn't get talked about enough, and is enormously a way for somebody to come in and create a reputation for themselves if they take these kinds of things very seriously. Sustainability and conservation.
I love it. And, maybe that's just another step towards 25, 30 more steps. And that's a great thing to hit on. So Kyle, I really appreciate it. I know Vangst and everyone that was here and everyone that will see this on video is really excited to have you. You definitely know what you're talking about. You're a joy to listen to. So definitely appreciate your time And anyone on the panel, if you haven't joined Vanks.com yet, do that. We have extraction panels and extraction conversations going on our forum and our communities page. So, feel free to, follow up on anything you didn't get answered today. But Kyle, just wanted to say thanks again, buddy.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.
Of course. Well, take care, everyone.
Take care.